Well, hi there. Welcome to Politics for People Who Hate Politics. I'm here with a small but very dependable, stalwart, and full of wisdom panel, which includes the familiar Jeffrey Tucker. I feel like Liberty.me is probably very sick of me this week because I keep popping up, but you know what? I'm not going to apologize because that's what Todd Seavey told me not to do, and he knows. Introduce yourself, kids. Chris, tell the people who you are, if you would.
Uh, yeah, I'm Chris Morgan. I'm a freelance writer. There you go.
Yay! All right, Todd.
I'm Todd Seavey, amongst other things, the author of Libertarianism for Beginners, which comes out in April. So buy that book. And I've written other libertarian things for splicetoday.com and other places.
And Jeffrey, I think people know who you are at this point.
The founder of Liberty.me and director at Foundation for Economic Education, and this and that. So
yes, we know it, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank
you. Jeffrey, you are very essential because we're going to talk about Trump, and you are arguably, very arguably, but let's just say arguably hyperbolic about Trump being really quite awful. And basically, National Review just came out with a new issue. I've seen the cover at least, and it says "Against Trump," and it has all of these conservatives, and it has like David Bose. I'm not sure if they have any other libertarians, but it's clearly like a whole big line in the sand. We're not.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a little bit like some tweet just said all six people who will pay attention to that, and that's more or less what you have going on here. I was thinking about the right way to think about Trump is a kind of blowback in a way. The establishment has alienated vast amounts of the American public. Nobody cares about politics anymore. People think it doesn't matter. They feel like their voices don't matter. They've more or less dropped out. A tiny number of people are supporting Trump for president, actually. But they're the tiny number of fanatics who still have faith in the system and have something to gain from the state, And again, this is how fascism takes over, essentially.
But I mean,
a ruling class fails, and a fanatic sweeps in to wipe the ruling class away. I mean, there's aspects of this we should be happy about, but not entirely. I mean, this phrase "blowback" actually, I think it pertains most to 9/11. 9/11 was not good. And Trump is a little bit of the 9/11 of politics.
Actually, I think there's something to that. The National Review cover kind of, puts us in this position of like, are we going to stand on the side of William Crystal and Katie Pavlich and just generally useless creatures just because we also dislike Trump? It's kind of a...
Well, I think the important thing is to understand something about the establishment, and to get that, you have to sort of read Machiavelli. The establishment wants control, but also wants stability and productivity, a system that they can pillage and loot for themselves while not letting the masses ever threaten their hegemony. And National Review is the establishment, and Trump represents a sort of threat to their hegemony. But not every threat, first of all, not every hegemonic ruling class is as bad as it can get. It can always get worse,
Yeah.
And an insurgency that's exploiting in a commodus-like fashion the failures of the ruling class is not necessarily something that's compatible with human liberty. So I don't know. I don't think it's right to consider Trump in isolation from the failures of the system that he's targeting and overthrowing, essentially. And you look at some of the complaints in National Review, and I haven't read it either, but you can know in advance sort of what they're saying, some good things and some bad things, right?
Right, yeah.
And so they don't like the fact that he's insufficiently pro-Christian right. Well, in a way, that's kind of like a good thing about Trump, actually. He's not like a pro-life fiend who wants to, have draconian, laws to enslave half the human population from the center, and he doesn't have any interest in the sort of theocratic agenda of the Christian right.
Except to pander to it, I think a little, enough to get by.
I mean, the Christian right,
Corinthians and all.
Right, 2 Corinthians. You know, the Christian right has surprised me a little bit because they've been willing to sort of more or less go along with Trump, which I've always suspected there was a fraud at the core of the Christian right, and I've never been able to put my finger on it. But I never really believed that they were driven by sort of pious concerns to implement Leviticus, you know, or anything like that, you know. And I think he's tapped into their sort of core nationalism. And their willingness to sort of throw away their principles to support him has been striking. And that aspect of things, you know, National Review is not too serious about their evangelical commitments either, but they're trying to exploit, you know, and drive a wedge between Trump and the Christian right, which is pointless. On the other hand, National Review is pretty, you know, probably fairly better than the average bloke on questions of immigration and multiculturalism. I mean, they're not openly racist. In fact, part of what drove National Review into existence was to drive out of the right, you know, the sort of cranky, crazy, anti-Semitic racialist elements and avowed segregationists that sort of inhabited the right. So in that sense, they're better than the hoi polloi who are supporting Trump, I would say. Yeah, but I don't believe that this issue is going to have any effect on anybody. I mean, look, Trump supporters don't read anything, you know, much less National Review.
What about what Michael Brennan Doherty wrote earlier in the week, this article that actually Rush Limbaugh read, where essentially Trump is taking Samuel Francis's intentions for Pat Buchanan and kind of blowing them up and making them.
I read that article, and I was intrigued by it because Sam was a friend of mine, and
so you're to blame for this, basically.
Well, I mean, the Buchanan thing, I wasn't, I'm not old enough to remember the Buchanan presidency, but, you know, like the Eric Garris and Justin Raimondo were who I sort of, you know, I trust on most days, or at least I trust Garris, let's say. We're big on Pat Buchanan. I mean, Pat Buchanan, very, like, not libertarian in a lot of ways, but he had sort of this this anti-war credibility, and he almost still does. And Trump has put in a couple of, you know, solid digs against Dick Cheney, but he doesn't have that same, even the credibility of Pat Buchanan, which to me isn't even saying that much.
I watched a Pat Buchanan speech recently, and I was shocked at how it is I didn't recognize his brown-shirted fascism at the time. I somehow thought that he was, you know, a confused. I think I was a much more naive in the past, really. Well, that was 20 years ago, after all. But I remember.
I was naive 20 years ago, too.
I didn't have any affections for him, but I never saw him as being, like, tapping into a fascist vein. As for Sam Francis.
He clearly had fascist tendencies.
Not just tendencies. The guy was a right-wing Marxist, a hardcore racist, and a dedicated anti-Semite who believed that the world was that the white middle class always and everywhere wants fascism, and we're just waiting for the opportunity to assert their will.
I hope that's not true.
and that someday that will would triumph. Okay, so.
Oh my God.
Yeah, no, this was Sam Francis. I mean, there wasn't a liberal bone in his body. By liberal, I mean, I don't know, you call it modern or classical, whatever. I mean, the guy was like a complete and dedicated sort of authoritarian, you know, sort of right-wing neo-Marxist. Who was a complete nihilist and believed in only one relevant and important power in the world, and that was power itself. Okay, that's Sam Francis. I knew him. I spent lots of evenings with him, and you know, this guy was brilliant, nihilistic, alienated, and extremely dangerous. Actually.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and I knew this about him at the time. You know, it's interesting. Part of the reason I'm a little bit passionate about this topic, about the existence of fascism as an ideology, is I think I went a large part of my life sort of not seeing it that way. I always regarded Sam as somebody who needed help, he needed education, you know, he needed to have a greater appreciation of economic principles. You know, it's not that I was quite making excuses for him, but I didn't see his ideology as a coherent package that was actually like a grave threat to civilization itself.
So in the early 90s, there was some overlap between paleo-libertarians, amongst whom I guess we could count you, Jeffrey, right? And the paleo-conservatives, like the Chronicles magazine
Oh,
crowd.
absolutely.
And I guess it's fair to say the reason that a lot of the Cato types to this day despise the Mises Institute and don't want to have anything to do with it is because they think it's like a road that leads to Sam Francis, even though he's dead.
Yeah, no, I think that's fairly accurate, and I think that in retrospect, I had no idea of the fires that were developing all around me, actually, and I just didn't see it at that point in history. I was never an enthusiast for this turn. It wasn't anything I welcomed or celebrated, and it alarmed me and it sort of bugged me in my gut. But I didn't see it for what it was, which is that essentially we were dealing, my friends, we're playing with fire, and the idea that Sam Francis would, for example, have been running in my circle in those days is in retrospect appalling to me. I mean, it's just sort of the absence of a basic liberal instinct that said, this guy actually represents the opposite of everything we stand for. That seemed to have gone weirdly missing for a few years, and it's actually deeply troubling. When I read that article in the week, and I was like deeply troubled by it because, like I say, Sam was around, and Sam hung around with the paleo-conservatives. He was their leading intellectual, and you're right. There were these things called paleo-libertarians at the time.
Well, still are if you count Ron
Indeed.
Paul as one, right?
I don't count Ron as one. I think Ron is
Oh.
an authentic liberal, and I never called myself and never considered myself that.
Okay.
But I justified it to myself in my own mind, based on this idea that somehow paleoism, meaning that we were recapturing the sort of original foreign policy of peace of somebody like Albert J. Nock or Garrett Garrett or something like that, and Murray's whole vision of the old right.
Mhm.
But I think Murray went through this funny period, at very late in life, where he decided to deliberately ignore vast amounts of his own writings warning about the inherent authoritarianism and danger from the right. He just kind of like shelved that for whatever reason, even though you can find a refutation or warnings about this now in retrospect. You can see he was writing about this all throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even early 80s, and then he gradually decided that things were so bad that we had to sort of rally around any anti-establishment groups that were around, and this sort of fascistic impulse was around, and I don't think Murray actually took it as seriously as he should have. I wonder if he were around today, he would see. I'm almost certain that he would look at somebody like Trump and go, you know what? Where are those old issues of the Libertarian Forum? Let me dig those up. Didn't I write an article or two about this subject? And would snap out of it. Actually, I'm almost certain of it.
I seem to recall Rothbard and Rockwell also went through a period of being fairly enthusiastic about Perot's 92 presidential run, which is sort of a precursor to Trump, I suppose, that reform
I
part.
wonder if that's true. I've thought about that sometimes because I was personally an enthusiast for Ross. But if you look back at Ross Perot's campaign, he was all about government reform. And I really make a sharp distinction between what Trump is aspiring to and what Ross Perot did. Ross Perot wanted to get the government under control, subject it to regular accounting methods. He was appalled at the sort of the out of control spending and the debt and that sort of thing. He had flavors of the same sort of populist flavor, but he never imagined himself to be like the coming CEO of the country. I mean, he might have imagined himself the CEO of a government, but a national takeover, I don't recall that Ross ever used that kind of language. I would say this is substantively different than the Ross Perot.
Trump, there isn't any even attempt at sort of a libertarian-esque foundation. It's almost, I mean, it feels like a strongman foundation, but it's more, Trump is a winner and will make America a winner again, and all these losers are doing. I mean, it's really truly at sort of a second-grade level. It's not even trying to be, like I'm used to a trillion people claiming to be small government, or at least in some areas, and then lying about it. And
Yeah.
Trump is just about great and winning. It's just,
I suppose if you wanted to see Trump through that Reform Party lens, you could say that he's a little bit like a compromise between Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan, in that Ross Perot was interested in the businessman stuff, and Pat Buchanan is really all about the culture war. And Trump
Right.
sounds enough like a culture warrior, with his
Attacks
comments
on PC and so on. Yeah.
that he appeals probably to some of the same people who were drinking beers and praising Pat Buchanan.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, there definitely is that same sort of appeal. And
Yeah, but
maybe
he picked it up kind of opportunistically, right? Because people keep dragging out these interviews he did where Trump was saying, "Oh, Pat Buchanan is wrong on immigration. He's anti-gay. He's racist, and all these things." And then later he takes these up a bit more opportunistically because there's a big backlash against, I don't know, Prague culture or something like that.
That's really interesting. Again, I know Pat Buchanan. I had dinner with him several times and that sort of thing. I was initially, I guess I was like lukewarm. I was a little bit squeamish about him. It didn't last long. I mean,
Well, he was establishment too, kind of, because he worked for Reagan and he worked for Nixon. So he
I'm
wasn't.
almost, and I think he is in fact a dedicated fascist, and I don't think any libertarian can support Pat Buchanan, and that became very obvious to me by, I guess, 1993. I think he ran for president in '92, and I just held my nose, and then I was just like done with him, very very quickly. Although even then, I didn't quite see that he represented a sort of a gigantic and very threatening tradition of thought. Again, this is why I'm a little bit passionate about this topic. I feel like libertarians need to be aware of the existence of fascism as a coherent ideology and begin to recognize its traits and signs. And I don't think
can you say, Jeffrey, what is somewhat fascism? Because it's one of those things that people have bandied about in the past.
Well, unfortunately, every time this subject comes up, what happens is that people give a tedious list of traits, and I don't know how else to avoid this, but essentially it's as anti-liberal as left socialism, but it just comes from the right. What it does is it takes socialist ideology and cuts out from it all the things that the bourgeoisie don't like the attack on religion, the attack on family, and the attack on property and business. Because, I mean, the bourgeoisie sort of more or less like their religion. They like their property. People are not against successful business as the Sanderites would like to believe. So it takes a kind of a collectivist, syndicalist perspective on the point and purpose of a nation, and purges it of its lefty and some would say liberal elements, and what you're left with is sort of a raw brown shirt authoritarianism. The signs of it are always the same, and you can read Mises's Omnipotent Government to understand this. But it begins always and everywhere with an attack on foreigners in our trading relationships and in migration. That they're poisoning us as a people. That is like the beginning, opening salvo for any fascistic ideology. In fact, I don't think you can really say anything is fascistic without that sort of core principle.
Well, then here's the uncomfortable question, though, is that people that we all like a bit better, like Ron Paul, have dabbled in the semi-xenophobic fear-mongering. I mean, even Ron Paul's campaign in 2008 was more that way than his 2012 campaign.
The first ad I ever saw for Ron Paul featured wetbacks swimming across the Rio Grande. And I turned off the TV and decided to not be interested in the campaign.
Yeah. I mean, the majesty of Ron Paul to me is that his final, months in government were when he was at his best and most libertarian in a lot of ways. And he even lessened that sort of hideousness. But I mean, how do we know that Ron Paul was sort of a net, generally good thing, and that Trump is like an actual fascist? I mean, it seems like it's blur. It's blurrier than we'd like it to be in that way.
It is blurry, especially when you consider the number of Ron Paul supporters who are now Trump supporters. I mean, it's
now that's disheartening.
And I must tell you, Lucy, and let me preface this by saying that I defend Ron Paul. I think he's an honest and true blue fee-type liberal. He was trained under Hans Sennels. He's got a good heart. I worked for him. I love him. I think he's the real deal. The movement that gathered up around him, though, is something different. It had a different feel and sensibility from Ron himself. Usually in the history of politics, the followers are better than the leaders. In the case of the Ron Paul movement, the leader is always better than his followers.
Yeah.
And I
agree with that.
Yeah, and I heard for 8 years, about 10 years really, it would have been 8 years, no, longer, that with Ron Paul made libertarianism a national force, that we had finally arrived, thanks to his campaign efforts, that after struggling in the wilderness for 50 years, we had finally reached the land of milk and honey. And I was never able to put my finger on it, but I never believed that. And something always troubled me about both campaigns, and I couldn't quite identify it. And every time I'd start to express doubts, I'd be shouted down by these fanatics. Oh, are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
Don't you see what he's done for us? Are you being ungrateful for this great man and what he's done and these awesome campaigns and how they've changed the world and how finally everything you've ever worked for in life is coming true? What the hell is wrong with you? And I'd be shouted down like all the time. I mean, it was amazing. But now here we are in 2016. Where's the evidence?
It would be wonderful if we had really good demographic numbers on which libertarians believe what, because it's often very unclear. But one thing I thought was, probably we've all talked about at some point, is Rand Paul being only about a tenth as popular as Ron Paul. And there are different reasons that could be, and people tend to always describe him as, having failed because he didn't do things the way they wanted them done. But it's possible that he's only a tenth as popular because he deliberately avoided all of the populist and xenophobic sounding things.
I appreciate your comment there, and I think there's something to that. I've never heard this figure 10%. I don't quite believe it, but what people need to understand, I mean, there are all these people out there that still believe the nomination was stolen from Ron, which is amazing, because there's like no evidence of this whatsoever. He tended to around 13% support among Republicans, and what. I mean, you asked the interesting question, like how many of those 13%, which is not enough to get the nomination, obviously, supported him for basically for the wrong reasons, for the dog whistles that his campaign was sending out, not for Ron himself. And it's very troubling, but I mean, you have to ask the question, if these two presidential campaigns were so awesome and put libertarianism on the map and blah, 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 you hear all this language, where is the evidence of this now? Where's the liberal impulse in the Republican Party? I mean, it's just not there. All we're seeing is a battle between two groups, the brown shirts and the establishment. Basically, it's a National Review versus everybody else, and I don't see any evidence of libertarianism at all.
I wonder if it's a matter of style, if anything, because to some extent, the Pauls are trying to be somewhat wonky or very principled and very moral in their presentation, of their ideas, whereas Trump just kind of goes with the no bullshit, elevator pitch type oratory. And I was thinking earlier, what if, Trump makes a lot of promises that he can't really enact on his own, I think, like building walls to keep out, Mexicans or whatever. And what if someone, a candidate more to the left, went out, did the same Trump-style thing and just said, unilateral nuclear disarmament for the United States, or something like that? Impractical, and would not be very popular in any case, but
clear branding.
Clear branding,
yeah.
Moral high ground compared to what Trump offers.
But
and
xenophobia has been popular for a very long time in America, and I mean, and elsewhere. It really works like a charm. It's It's almost more popular than war because it
Th-
costs. It
This
doesn't even cost American soldiers. You can just.
Yeah.
is what troubles me most about thinking about Sam Francis, because he was convinced that the masses are basically fascistic, that the intellectual elites, the urbanites, and the alienated, other that are running the financial system, like, okay, we know what he means. We're socialistic, and that the masses in the heartland, the hoi polloi, the sort of workers and peasants, were basically fascistic, and they'll never be satisfied until they get a regime that rules in their favor, aka Hitler. Okay,
Oh,
so
good.
this and it haunts me.
Yeah.
I mean, his claims in this respect are haunting. And I worry about libertarianism too. If you don't mind, let me just quickly relay an anecdote from another Sam Francis friend named Paul Gottfried. He was and is, he's still alive, a political scientist and a specialist in the thought of Carl Schmitt, who was an interwar German intellectual who became a big supporter of Hitler. And Paul Gottfried himself is, basically a proto-fascist with some classical liberal impulses. And he said to me one time, he said, you consider yourself an anarchist and a libertarian. He said, but your ideology is too abstract. That might be like rationalistically correct, but it's never going to take off. He said, Jeffrey, you might as well embrace fascism now, because there will come a time in our future where it's going to be the only alternative to the left, and you will rally around it, just like.
What would the fucking difference be then? I mean, really, like, what kind of selling point is that?
I know. Well,
It's
so
so
this is what disturbs me. Is there a kind of strain of conservatism that presently exists within the libertarian framework that's just enough to sort of mutate into a cancerous, fascistic support of somebody like Donald Trump? And I wonder if that does exist.
Yes, and
So
actually,
we're going to be talking about Cantwell, I guess, because this is just the mighty lead up to discussing.
Well,
Cantwell.
and he's a troll, but an archetype.
But I was going to say, it's a sad thing when you not only need to talk about fascists, but perhaps need to come up with terms for different types of fascists. If there are enough of them, we might have to start using different words like statist fascist and anarcho-fascist and so forth. But I think
right fascist, left fascist.
Yeah, I think there might be enough of them out there that you sometimes encounter sort of the so-called dark enlightenment types who
NRX.
who don't want a big government, but definitely are fascinated by fascist ideology in a scary way, and in a very Sam Francis-like way will say libertarianism is too dry and abstract and it doesn't stir the heart, and blood and soil are the important thing. But they just want things to be much more decentralized, and they're much more skeptical about the military than maybe a Trump would be.
Yeah, those are strange words.
But crucially, they still tend to be racists, from what I've seen.
Racialism is crucial, and I tell you, the question is like, why does it always come back to racism? And I think really the answer to that is that it's a loss of faith in the how would you say, the decentralized, depersonalized system of commercial exchange. In Weimar Germany, that's what failed, and that's what led to the rise of Hitler. Finally, Hitler said, look, your money has failed you, your economic life has failed you. Look down. Who are you? What are you? You're a German. Look at the color of your skin. It's your identity that is the crucial molecule of politics that you need to be thinking about. And all fascistic ideology is ultimately about identity. It rejects the impersonal forces of markets and the impersonal sort of idea of liberalism, which is that people of different types can ultimately find mutual benefit by getting along with each other. It rejects that ideology. It says, you know what? If we're going to survive as a people, we have to rally around identity and race.
white skin feels fairly impersonal to me, though. I mean, a market, as we all know, a market can be the most personal thing in the world because it's just you and I exchanging A and B. The fact that, my God, look how white this, my skin is. What is that? And that's not.
I don't know.
That's not the heart of me, at all.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's pathetic, and this is why I never believed Sam was right about this. And I, again, I've carried around these warnings, I don't know what you call them warnings, but these sort of ominous statements from Francis and Paul Gottfried for 20 years, and I've always been a little bit haunted by them. And I never really took it seriously until very recently, and this is why the rise of Trump has troubled me so very, very much, actually.
Another thing that makes it tough to gauge how much of this is occurring is that the hardcore racists tend to know that their views aren't popular, so they sort of speak in code.
Yeah.
So, I've had people say things to me where, like, I think they're trying to feel me out to figure out whether I know, like, the secret Odin-worshipping Nazi code words or something.
I know. You get it all.
Oh, I love the number 88, don't you, Todd?
Yeah.
God, it's a great number.
No, I mean, I've, my own ban list is so long, you just can't believe it. I mean, 2015 was the year in which I purged all neo-Nazis from my social network, and I've developed such a good nose for these people. Like, I recognize them so quickly. And
of course, if they're young, which disturbingly they often are now, they could be joking or using irony, so it's very hard to tell. There are so many reasons it's hard to tell what's going on. Maybe I'm just getting old and out of touch.
No, that's true.
Well, I don't know, but you're right that the fascists always believe that basically that they're the brave ones that are out in front, and they're speaking the truths that they sort of slightly shy hoi polloi, believe and say and pillow talk, but are unwilling to say in public. So they consider themselves to be out in front. And I by the way, I'm no longer of the view that Trump is an inadvertent fascist. I think I think he understands exactly what he's doing. And he understands that the term Muslim is not really mean adherence to the Islamic faith. What he understands is that it's just a stand-in for any sort of non-white Christians, essentially.
Well, I mean, the idea that Mexicans were, if we can remember far back before Muslims were the most fearsome creatures,
That's right.
It was Mexicans who tend to be, Catholic. So I've never quite grasped the fear of them just ruining everything when they share the damn same religion.
Right, and his attack on Cruz as being, you remember his comment that he doesn't think a lot of evangelicals come out of Cuba? You remember that? Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely a dog whistle that was essentially anti-Catholic, treating Catholics as alienated and essentially un-American.
There have been articles claiming Trump's father was a Klansman at one point. Could it actually be a very conscious family tradition? I'm surprised I haven't heard more about that. And if I were on the ball, I would have checked up and verified on that before the podcast started.
I don't know. Every time I hear some terrible thing about Trump, I Google it up, and it seems to be true. Like the claim that he had a copy of Hitler's speeches on his nightside table. That seems to have been. There's a lot of evidence.
I mean, that doesn't have to be deeply disturbing necessarily, but I think it's sort of turning out that way. I mean, I have many books about World War II in my bedroom. And I don't. I have no sympathy for Nazism, so I'm hoping that's okay.
No, I mean, and I don't know if you read my article the other day because it puts me in an awkward position because I was joking that with Lucy earlier today on instant message that I heard from. This is a boring story because I can't actually reveal the names, but I heard from a friend who had lunch today with, let's just say, a very high-ranking member of the establishment.
All right.
That's all I can tell you. And this very high-ranking member of the establishment was deeply alarmed about the rise of Trump and what it could mean for the stability of the system that they've worked for 100 years to create, essentially. And I was joking with Lucy. I said, I was so grateful to hear this because it was our only hope at this point is the entrenched establishment. Do they have enough power and credibility left to beat back this guy? She said, "You're a hell of an anarchist." Carrying on the establishment.
That's awful. That is the the question, though. Like, do we want the horrible stuff that we know? I mean, some people, hell, my social anarchist California cousin is tempted to sort of root for Trump because he thinks Trump can, like, destroy everything in America. And he's like, yes, come on. So there's always that option.
And there's other people who think that he needs to get the nomination so he'll lose and therefore elect Hillary Clinton. I mean, there's all these. There's another view out there. I mean, this stuff gets so complicated. There's all these members of the Republican establishment who think that Trump would be a better choice than Cruz because Cruz is such a jackass. He can't work with anybody, and that they think in the end Trump is just a cynic who's saying all this prattle, to trick, the.
It's so hard to tell with him.
Yeah.
His manner is very strange in that way.
Cruz seems to me like basically a circa 1986 Reaganite with actually some more libertarian tendencies. So
must I quote the Iran sailor quote from Cruz, Todd? The full force and fury of the United States should have come upon, if I mean, come on. 12-hour detainment, and he was just, crocodile tearing up with the best of them. Like, there's no there, dude.
Well, nobody's perfect, but he sounded sympathetic to drug legalization. He wants lots of downsizing of government. He seems to be familiar with the constitutional legal arguments behind all these things instead of just shooting his mouth off like a Trump. And pretty much every other Republican candidate except for Rand Paul has been very actively, explicitly anti-libertarian. At this point, Cruz is the only object large enough to hurl in Trump's path to the nomination. So I think it's Cruz or bust at this point, and I'm basically rooting for him to win in Iowa.
But Todd, for that matter, you can point to aspects of Trump that are delightfully libertarian, and if anybody in this phone call is going to tell me that you want to throw up every time Trump opens his mouth, I'll call you a liar, because I mean there are some things about him that are kind of awesome, like his one issue he's been consistently wonderful about, and here's where he departs from his fascist script, is gun control. I mean, he's finally the one guy who's actually like saying what's true. It's gun-free zones that have caused a lot of these violence.
Cruz is great on that too.
Yeah, but you have to wonder about, I think, both Cruz and Trump on this issue is like, and I've reflected on this myself. I mean, I don't want to just be like, just develop this confirmation bias, that we develop once we write something like I've written against Trump, so now I have to like hate him forever. But you have to wonder, okay, so you get the power, how do you know that you're not just saying these things in order to get the election, to get in power, and then your tune changes? What happens?
Well, it always changes. I mean, everybody's tune changes.
Yeah. So I don't know how seriously to take this. I mean, there's one thing that I know Trump believes in, and that's his own brilliance, magnificence, authority, and power, right?
Yeah.
So
Cruz at least seems to have a more developed ideology than that. I mean, I think Trump is going to be pretty randomized. I don't know exactly what he's going to do. I think I can predict roughly what Cruz would do. But by the way, in a reminder that Trump is sort of a centrist, in some ways establishment type, Jesse Walker from Reason retweeted a tweet from one Nick Confessori who made this observation. Trump used to back Hillary, who endorsed Gore, who ran with Lieberman, who endorsed McCain, who picked Palin, who has endorsed Trump. So maybe they're all...
That's just it, isn't it?
Maybe they're all the same, actually, and it's just a big Mobius strip of futility.
Oh, it is. No, I mean, we could just all walk away on that note. All of this entire conversation, which has been both incredibly depressing and extremely enlightening.
One thing I would say about that though is and again, I find myself just like haunted by this shit that I've heard and I've read. But I mean, the book that alerted me initially to Trump as a grave danger to our liberties is Omnipotent Government by Ludwig von Mises in 1944. And there's another book that came out in 1944 called The Road to Serfdom by F.A. Hayek. And he says in there that the generation earlier, even 10 years before the rise of Hitler, that nobody would have believed that Hitler would ever emerge with the kind of power he had, and that a lot of the political coalition who backed Hitler was gravely skeptical of him as a person. They thought he was an imperfect messenger, but the best of a lot of bad options, and thought that many of the things he was griping about had a legitimate basis. So,
like the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, it's true.
The Treaty of Versailles, and the corruption of the Weimar, government and so on.
The lovely decadent Berlin was nice, though.
Yes, of course. But the unfair, the harsh terms of the war and everything. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't, there were a lot of people who looked at him and said, well, he's not exactly the guy we'd choose, but there we go. So they find themselves in this sort of national crisis where a whole civilization essentially goes bonkers, and every public school kid now for 70 years has been, asked the question, how can a perfectly civilized society, the land of Goethe, collapse into the kind of brutality that we saw from the Nazis, the psychopathology and mass death and so on. And Hayek really addresses this, and I think it's a mistake to think that we are immune from this. I really do. I mean, shit happens, And
we always think it's different this time, even if we think we know how it happened before, and even if it's doing the same, the same thing's happening, we think there's something different about it.
And let me just quickly defend my what seems to be my defense of the establishment here. The reason I prefer the Rockefellers over the Trumps at this point is that I feel like history, in absence of some gigantic political upheaval, is in fact headed the right way. Through the peer-to-peer economy, through the obvious failures of government in so many areas of life, from communication to security to just across the board, we are headed by default, not by intention, but by default, in the direction of liberty. And I want this progress to continue. And the thing that threatens it all, it seems to me, is a misdirected revolutionary political movement that would put somebody like Trump in charge. It would exploit the failures of the present regime to foster his personal power.
Well, I also have a certain amount of sympathy for the establishment, and I suppose, like Jeffrey, would proudly call myself bourgeois. I mean, there are much worse things than the quiet suburbs I grew up in the 80s, and I don't want the whole world to turn into Burning Man for 2 weeks and then to turn into a Nazi rally 2 weeks later.
Either. So, I mean,
stability has some things going for it.
Well, I mean, we've all. I mean, the kids probably have learned all this from the Hunger Games. I mean, I realize that real life and more sophisticated literature also teaches this lesson, but to me, like, the takeaway message from the YA series, The Hunger Games, is that you can have a just war and a heinous government that, like, it will be justified in overthrowing, and you can have either the exact same thing, be the revolutionaries that sweep it aside, or it can be worse even. I mean,
that's right. You have to get all the way to part 3 in order to see that, but that is an important message.
There are hints of that, but yeah.
I love that. I love the Hunger Games because you're right. For a good part of the series, you're under the impression that really is a struggle between the government and the people. And it's no more complicated than that. By the time you get to the third one, you realize things are more complicated. That the people who are most incentivized to bring about this revolution do it for a reason, and that reason is that they themselves have as power aspirations. So you don't just, it's not just purely a Manichaean struggle between an obvious good and an obvious evil, that there's a lot of gray in between. And I think that's where we're sort of headed in these late days of statism, actually.
I hope it's late days of statism. That's a lovely, that'll be my takeaway of optimism, just the thinking of this as being the late days of statism. That's nice.
If things get really Weimar-like, perhaps we'll start seeing more fist fights on the street between members of Black Lives Matter and like skinheads. That's when we'll know it's really getting like 1932.
Or it's California. I mean, like, social anarchists are like, so I was beating up some neo-Nazis. Like, how many neo-Nazis are there? I mean, like, the only people who can find them are like the black blocking anarchists in hoodies.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of them. Look, it's our job as libertarians to be an alternative to this stuff. You raise the prospect of street fights between Black Lives Matter and skinheads. I mean, where do libertarians fit into this? And I always return back to Mises. You know, we have to just hold up the banner high of human liberty and liberalism, and a society of like Hayek said, of spontaneous evolution, absent coercion, and the possibility that actually we don't need an authoritarian master to cause us to get along, that the society is capable of its own self-management. And I don't know what else to say. I mean, we have to be the light in the midst of all this darkness.
And if you find yourself
no, it was just so optimistic. Okay, go ahead.
If you find yourself trying to convey that message very succinctly in the middle of a fist fight between skinheads and Black Lives Matter members, I would say just shout, "No hitting! No hitting!" That would be the short version.
Yeah, and in there, I think this is what's ironic to me. I feel like we have a lot of allies out there in strange places. I'm finding them more and more. I find myself agreeing with people that I've spent my life opposing. New York Times editorial board. I'm sorry to say. I mean,
they've had their moments, but
the naive neoliberals at Vox.com and so on. I mean, people are actually starting to make some sense.
And National Review.
And National Review.
I'm so conflicted, and there's many more minutes than 10 minutes left of conflict within me, and there's even a whole other libertarian subtopic that came out of all that Trump talk that we can't really get into, because we have 10 minutes left, which is the perfect time to do the final obligatory segment of what have you been enjoying in the last week or two that has nothing to do with politics, because we have to do that, because we hate politics here. That's our thing. Someone.
Well, Lucy, I think I'm looking forward to the return of X-Files. There's a 6-episode season. It hasn't been well reviewed, but I don't care. And it looks from the ads like they're directly addressing the fact that we live in sort of an Edward Snowden era. And they're analogizing Mulder to that kind of whistleblower, which makes a lot of sense in these changed times. And it looks like the ads might also suggest they're going straight back to the source and talking about Roswell. So maybe we'll bring the whole thing full circle, 1947 to 2016. Could be good. Starts Sunday night.
Yeah, I was going to rewatch, skipping the horrible season 7, and finally getting to season 8 and 9 of The X-Files, which I never watched. And I have stalled out by accident just because life is distracting on season 4. But I'm still looking forward to these episodes. And Todd and I think, at some point, are going to be participants in an X-Files themed episode of the show, because there's an incredible amount of libertarian things to mull over in that show, with paranoia and just how that show even influenced the culture and influenced the sort of quasi-libertarian / insane people like Alex Jones who have a weird amount of power. There's a lot of libertarian there, I think. So Todd and I are going to do that maybe 2 weeks from now, if we can.
It's so funny how you said it has nothing to do with politics, and yet every you got
Damn it! That was turned into a plug. You're right. I'm sorry, Jeffrey. I violated my own rules. But I have been watching The X-Files, and I started rewatching the movie Brick, which is a really good.
That's a great movie.
High school film noir, which is awesome.
And that director is now working on Star Wars Episode 8, by the way.
Yes, Star Wars. Don't talk to me about Star Wars. I'm angry at Star Wars. Chris, what have you been enjoying in the last week or two? Or looking forward to? I guess we can do that too.
I've been rewatching the movie Ravenous, which you may or may not have heard of. It came out in 1999. It's a horror film. It's a horror comedy that's actually pretty funny. Nobody watched it when it came out because it's just like this weird thing. It takes place in the 1840s. Guy Pearce plays an army colonel who is stationed in the Sierra Nevada region, and Robert Carlyle plays the survivor of a group traveling west, and it's about cannibalism, basically, based on the Alfred Packer thing and the Donner Party.
That sounds like you've already almost sold me on that, except for the part where I imagine myself going like this a lot. So, but
It's kind of like that.
Carlisle is awesome. And
Yeah,
that
it's
is
pretty ridiculous.
good.
And the singer of Blur did the soundtrack, which is pretty interesting too.
That seems anachronistic, but all right.
It totally failed at the box office, but it's one of my favorite movies, and it's a good winter movie too, I think.
Yeah, or a little too good.
A little too.
Jeff, what about you? Pop
Oh, well,
culture?
in music, I've fallen back in love with the Brahms violin trios, which I can't get enough of. In movies, I love The Revenant. I just wrote a review today that comes out
Cool.
tomorrow. And in sports,
Really?
I know, I'm just going to wait. I have become a fanatic for ice skating.
Okay.
I mean, it seems like something you can't do, and the first time you do it, it's just a disaster. You know, you're just like no fun at all. And then, but then you realize I can learn, I can do this, and so you come back a second time and like, wow, you're better than you were. And by the end of the second time, you know, you're starting to be like, you know, moderately okay and actually having fun. Then you go to the third time and suddenly you realize I'm a freaking ice skater. You know, I'm doing this, and I just can't seem to get enough of it. And I have no theory as to why. It doesn't fit in with any worldview, no ideological impulses, nothing. I just like putting on ice skates and skating around. So that's my newest discovery, and it's kind of awesome for me. It's what I guess you could say it's an individualistic sport, you know, maybe, but I'm really enjoying being an ice skater. And my friend Stefan Kinsella says, you know, Jeffrey, do you always have to like give all your enemies fodder for you? I mean, ice skating, really? But you know, okay, I love ice skating.
He's a crank. I don't even know what that means. I'm gonna get him on here someday. Someday I'm gonna have an IP panel and we'll have Kinsella on.
By an incredible coincidence, my daily online column tomorrow will have a link to an ice skating sequence. Because tomorrow's column on Splice Today, my Friday piece will be about things I like about Mormons, and it will include a link to Donnie and Marie singing their cover of Steely Dan's "Reelin' in the Years," which included a big ice skating sequence.
That's perfect.
Because that's what you do if you're Donnie.
Once you see ice skating, you know, and I had to pick up ice skating after the end of the Packers season, and which I weirdly became a fan of the Packers this season too. It's a strange
many things I learn about you every podcast.
Strange things happen. So you know, here we go. We're just doing that. I'm just going with what it is. It's a new adventure for me, so it's fun.
All right. Well, all right. And quickly plug some stuff. Where should people go to see all your works? Jeffrey, since you.
I'm at Liberty.me, and if you don't join, you're just not cool.
That's true.
And my workaday sort of thing is I'm building Fee up, and we are rocking the hell out of the site traffic right now, I must say.
I gotta write some stuff for you guys one of these days. I gotta do it. Chris, where should people read your writings or any of your life things?
I have stuff coming up in the American Conservative again once I write it, and First Things once it's edited, and I have a blog called blackribbonaward.wordpress.com that I write on every now and then. I've been slow in the beginning of the year, but hopefully I'll be more active very shortly.
All right, and Todd, what about you?
The splicetoday.com columns that I mentioned earlier, and in April, Libertarianism for Beginners, the book, and actually you can find links to both of those things in turn on toddseavey.com.
All right,
Awesome.
Sounds good. People can go to antiwar.com where I tend to show up. Hoping I get some more diverse work up in the next week or two. I won't say, you know, you'll find it if I want you to find it. And the old Stag blog, I'm probably going to try to write some weird nonsense about nuclear war and put it up there soon. And obviously Liberty.me is a very exciting place, and you should go to it all the time because I'm there, and so is Jeff. And this was a much better podcast. I would like to thank Chris for stepping in at the last minute, and for Jeff and Todd for being so dependable. It was a bit somber, a bit depressing, but it was actually
very revealing. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to think about on these subjects, and this is a good venue to do it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you all, and thanks audience now and audience later, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.